The main room of the magic tower today became the place of judgment, where a girl stood in the center of the room in front of 13 magicians. The only man with his head uncovered said that the Council of Magicians had made its decision, and Selena would be expelled. The girl standing in the center of the room was quite surprised by this decision of the Council of Magicians. While the Supreme Magician continued to say that the girl's research had become too dangerous and frightened many, thereby explaining the reasons for the decision, Selena herself thought that she was being driven out by the one whom she had picked up from the street, whom she had taught magic, who had reached such a position only thanks to her. At the thought of expulsion, the girl's face changed, and only one thought came to her head: that this guy does not know gratitude. Meanwhile, the Supreme Magician declared that if she calmly accepted their decision, they would not kill her, but would only deprive her of her magical abilities, giving her the opportunity to live out her life as an ordinary person. The girl silently listened to everything that the Archmage said, and when he finished, Selena sharply told Malik that either he was out of his mind, suggesting such a thing, or there was something wrong with the girl's perception, since she heard such a proposal, which she could not call anything other than complete nonsense. Saying that it was she who founded the Kingdom of Magicians, Selena kicked the stone floor as hard as she could, using magical power. The shockwave created by the girl knocked down some of the magicians surrounding Malik, but he, calling everyone to calm, said that this was Selena's last chance. At the same moment, the girl began to be entangled in chains controlled by the magical powers of Malik and the other 12 magicians. And in a matter of seconds, the girl stood shackled with chains on which special charms had been cast. Gathering all her strength, Selena tried to break the chains, but was unable to do so. Continuing to look at the girl's useless efforts, Malik said that he was using her own spell in these chains, only modified, and once again noted that her activities had become dangerous, and the very existence of the girl in this world now brought danger to people. Selena, who understood what the man was getting at, looked in surprise at her judge, with whom they had previously had a lot in common. Her hand itself fiddled with the robe the girl was wearing, revealing that she was still nervous, even though she was trying to appear calm. Meanwhile, all the magicians began to wield their magic wands, and Malik told the girl to get ready. Selena's gaze completely conveyed what was happening inside the girl, where her past together with Malik flashed before her eyes, where with him she finally found a family. They studied magic together, were both friends and colleagues, and experienced both life and death together. And this man was for her the only and most valuable thing that could be obtained in this life. Now, instead of that dear and beloved person, in front of the girl stood her judge and executioner rolled into one. While all these thoughts were running through Celine's head, the magicians carrying out the sentence read spells, and a magic circle appeared under the girl, where, with complete hopelessness in her gaze, Selena noted that they were preparing to use the magic of complete disappearance on her, which would allow them to erase all traces of her existence. At the same time, her power is suppressed with the help of spells she created, preparing to destroy her body, soul, and mana. Looking up at her executioner, the girl asked him the question of how he even decided and was capable of such a thing, but her answer was silence. Malik did not say a word. Hanging her head, Selena sadly concluded that no one would even try to save her in this situation, and the spell began to work, and the girl's body gradually dissolved in the air. The girl gathered all the strength she had left, concentrating carefully and trying to break free. But having anticipated such actions, the Supreme Magician strengthened the effect of his spell, restraining Selena's power. In a fit of rage, the girl shouted that she cursed and hated the Archmage Malik, and she added that if she somehow returns to Earth, is reborn, or becomes undead, then she will finish him off first. Watching Selena's body gradually dissolve into thin air, Malik said that she would no longer be able to do anything without the ability to use her magic, and would finally feel like an ordinary person, whom she once looked down on. After what had been said, the man suddenly thought that Selena had not tried to use black magic, which meant control over these abilities of hers also with the help of his spell. Selena suddenly noticed with horror that she, the head of the Kingdom of Magicians, the greatest sorceress, was dying here, just like that, dissolving completely in the air. A satisfied smile and an arrogant look accompanied Malik's last word that Selena heard, which was the word goodbye. The girl could no longer say anything, because the lower part of her face had already disappeared into the air, and therefore she only thought about how he dared to say goodbye to her like that, as if she were nothing to him. And with the last dissolved particles of Selena's body, her last thought addressed to Malik, which was expressed in just one word, flew into the air. After wandering around in pitch darkness, Selena suddenly saw a bright light, rejoicing that she could finally go to heaven or hell. But suddenly, a chandelier appeared before her eyes, provoking a reasonable question from the girl about where in the afterlife the chandelier could have come from and why everything was so high here. Deciding to look around, she suddenly saw a small hand that clearly belonged to a child. And when she tried to utter a word, Selena heard the inarticulate sounds of a child who had not yet learned to speak coming out of her mouth. With horror, the girl discovered that she was not in the afterlife, but in the body of some baby. A maid suddenly appeared and said displeasedly that the child was being very noisy. And with a quick movement of her hand, the girl's mouth was plugged with a pacifier, after which the maid returned to her daily duties. Having finally convinced herself that this was not a dream or the afterlife, Selena tried to move and discovered that this body did not obey her at all. But after several unsuccessful attempts, she finally managed to get into a sitting position. With bitterness, the girl noted that she hoped to live normally in hell after death, but instead of this, she received this small, weak body of a baby. Deciding to calm down and think things through, Selena carefully examined the room, finding it quite empty. Every now and then a maid passed by in one direction or the other, talking either to herself or to a child who did not understand anything. From the accent and specifics of conversational speech, Selena concluded with horror that most likely she was in the Koran Empire, where one very unpleasant acquaintance of hers from a past life was from. But immediately collecting her thoughts, the girl noted that the main thing was that she was alive again. The main thing was not to sit in this crib for years, waiting for her to grow up. And she also needed to understand whether her magical abilities were preserved. The object for training was a vase of flowers standing not far from the crib. The girl lay down with her arms outstretched and concentrated, trying to summon her mana and use magical powers, which she quickly succeeded in, where she moved the vase, causing it to break with a loud clang. Selena experienced true relief when she realized that her magical powers had not left her, and she could cast magic. And the maid, meanwhile, was lamenting over a vase that had broken for no reason, the cost of which would now definitely be deducted from her salary. Selena already had a plan for further actions ready, where she, trying to get to her feet, decided to first escape, then gain strength, strengthening her abilities in magic, and, of course, return to the tower for revenge on Malik. However, the girl, to her disappointment, discovered that she was completely unable to stand on her feet now. There was nothing left but to resort to magic again, which she immediately did. With concentration, Selena was able to lift this small body into the air, and after a few seconds, she moved from her small crib to the floor. Before she had time to crawl even a couple of meters, she was discovered by a vigilant maid who immediately returned her back to the crib, accompanying her movements with words of bewilderment as to how the child was able to get out of the bed. Suddenly, Selena felt very tired, and her eyelids became unbearably heavy, and she instantly fell asleep. The warm rays of the bright summer sun burst into the room where Selena had been living in her new body for a month. Lying in her crib, the girl tried to systematize in her thoughts what she had learned over the past time. One of the observations was that her maids change about once a week, and most of the time, no one needs her at all. The maids have enough to worry about, so they just run in to feed the child and leave her completely alone for several hours. Another observation was that you need to be careful with the pacifier, since its presence in the mouth works better than any sleeping pill, instantly putting you to sleep. And finally, some observations allow the girl to make an assumption that she is with the Crown Duke of Koran. There were many legends about this empire, including the legend that one day a beautiful person with silver hair came down from paradise, fell in love with a man, and they had children with silver eyes that do not exist in the human world, which their descendants inherited. Subsequently, one of the silver-eyed ones made a great contribution to the development of the empire, for which their family was honored by the emperor, where their family became noble. All that remained was to understand what kind of body Selena got, where, according to her assumptions, this child somehow belongs to the Duke's family, not being a commoner, but at the same time, the birth of this child was not desired. Once again, using her magical abilities, Selena moved from her small crib to the pal, and here she was struck by the thought that she might well be the child of the inadequate, in her opinion, tyrant, Edward. And with these thoughts, the girl crawled forward. Once she was soon at the door, she used magic again to open the door, and at that moment she realized that she could only use magic while lying down and using her entire small body, which in itself made it difficult to escape from this place. There was no exit immediately beyond the door. Instead, Selena saw a large, long corridor. Without hesitation, the girl began to cover quite a distance for this body. Stopping, she suddenly decided that first she should just explore the castle, where she was so happy with her brilliant idea that she dropped the pacifier and decided to wash it somewhere first. She crossed another corridor in search of a place where she could wash her pacifier, dirty from a fall. Behind this corridor was the next one. And finally, tired Selena sat down on the floor, concluding that this mansion was simply huge and she would have to explore it forever. At that moment, her attention was attracted by the sound of pouring water, where, turning her head, the girl in the girl's body saw a huge fountain. Quite quickly, she crawled out into the street, and the fountain was really huge for such a small body that the girl got. For a second, Selena thought that maybe she should return. But then, remembering what she had to endure on the way here, she discarded this thought. At the same time, the Duke walked past, accompanied by his butler. They just caught the child at the very moment when she was trying to reach the water to wash her pacifier. With a hint of hostility in his voice, the Duke asked the butler Parsons what it was, pointing towards the fountain. Parsons replied with complete equanimity that it was obvious that the child was the daughter of the late Mr. William. The Duke could not believe what he heard, since he believed that his late son's child should still be a baby. And of course, he was quite surprised at what she was doing here. Suddenly, the Duke heard the voice of Edward approaching, who asked what his father was doing now. The Duke pointed to the child at the fountain, answering the question asked by his son that this was the daughter of his late brother. William's reaction fully revealed his character and attitude towards his niece when he said that she was behaving strangely, since this child was not of pure blood, where his late brother entered into a relationship with a commoner. Unaware that she had already become the object of attention of the 3 inhabitants of this mansion, Selena still unsuccessfully tried to reach the water to wash her pacifier. Meanwhile, Edward, declaring that the presence of this creature here meant that the maids had not coped with their work, was preparing to use his magical abilities, and rays of magical energy had already begun to surround him. But the Duke, who intervened in the development of events, told the man to keep his power under control. This statement from his father caused a response from Edward, who said that the Duke had softened over time. To which the Duke noted with regret that his son began to be insolent to him more often, which is not very good. Probably realizing his father was right, Edward did not contradict him and simply listened to his reproach in silence. And all this time, Selena was trying to reach the treasured water, which should help her tidy up her pacifier. At some point, in despair, she, burning with rage that she found herself in such a helpless state, decided that she simply needed to use her magical abilities. She tried to focus on using her abilities, but suddenly remembered that she couldn't do it while standing. And at that moment, when she decided to lie down to use magical power, Selena saw 3 men standing nearby, among whom she immediately recognized Duke Dorian and his son Edward Bennett, who did not change much in their faces, which indicated that not much time had passed since her death. Only now did she fully imagine what could have happened if she had used her magical abilities in front of them. She stared intently at the face of Edward Bennett, who was smart, successful, and excellent at magic. Selina remembered well how she met him at the age of 16, just as she remembered well that he ignored everyone below him, communicating only with aristocrats. As for Dorian Bennett, dealing with him was even more difficult. The girl recalled the countless times she turned to the Duke with various requests and received numerous refusals. All this brought back sad memories of her past life, where she desperately defended her dear country, but was betrayed by those closest to her and was executed. But suddenly, leaving these sad thoughts about the past, Selina decided with great joy that this time everything would be different. She would win if she could take everyone by surprise. Meanwhile, Edward made a complaint to the maid in the part where, after the remark she had already made, she was still in no hurry to take the child back to the room, after which the maid literally took off from her place to fulfill the master's demand. Not wanting to be caught and not going back into the room, and also realizing that the pacifier was still dirty, Selina tried to crawl away from the maid. Watching the maid unsuccessfully try to catch a little girl running away from her on all fours, Edward compared the girl to a cockroach, which caused great bewilderment to his father. Probably thinking about what had been missed in raising his son, Duke Bennett turned away, where his sad thoughts were clearly reflected in his facial expressions. Meanwhile, Edward continued to be sarcastic, declaring that the very thought that this crawling creature had inherited part of the Bennett blood horrified him, and this half-breed should never bear their name. Dorian glanced at the game of catch that his granddaughter had arranged for the maid, after which, turning his head, he said that without his son's reminders, he perfectly remembers the origin of this child and imagines her future. And finally, the maid still managed to catch a child who was quick beyond his years, where she did not hesitate to voice to the girl that because of her, she received a scolding from Mr. Edward, which Selina was not at all interested in, since she thought that they could catch her even though she was moving at maximum speed. A few days later, bright and warm rays of the sun again burst into the room where the little girl lived, in whose body Selina ended up. The girl in the body of a girl lay in her crib and thought that she, the powerful magician Selina, could now really be considered dead, since some maid was able to catch her. Well, the maid, in turn, was very surprised that the last few days that Selina spent rethinking her life, the child was behaving very quietly. However, this new life, and even with the preservation of abilities for magic, could not but rejoice and was definitely better than the afterlife. The maid declared that the child had nothing to be happy about because she was a half-breed and would never live the life of an aristocrat, which today she definitely did not understand due to her age. But at the same time, the maid asked the child to behave the same way as everyone else. Last week. The words that a whole week had already passed made Selina furious because she had not even noticed this week. Thinking, she came to the conclusion that this dirty nipple was to blame for everything, while also thinking that, in principle, if mana circulates through the body, then it will cleanse itself of dirt. After all, it is thanks to this that magicians do not get sick, although there have been cases when magicians died from the improper use of mana. Through these thoughts, the girl came to the conclusion that she should be careful with mana in this body, because a small and untrained body may not be able to withstand the accumulation of a large amount of mana. For normal concentration and control of mana, through her tears, she decided to continue sucking the pacifier, which she again decided to try to wash. This time, the long corridors of the mansion did not seem as long to her as before, and after a short amount of time, Selina was already crawling along one of the paths outside the mansion. Finding herself on the grass, she suddenly noticed that it was much more comfortable to crawl here than along the stone corridors of the mansion. And again, thinking about her situation, Selina noted that there is no greater humiliation in the world for an aristocrat than to be born a bastard, and even in the Bennett family. But then the girl reassured herself that she still had everything ahead of her, and she would grow up to be a very powerful sorceress, where not only the Bennett family, but the entire empire will fall. With these positive thoughts, she continued on her way, also noting that she did not meet anyone either on the way here or in the garden itself, and that she could visit here more often. And finally, Selena saw what she had been looking for so long in the form of an artificial reservoir. Instantly finding herself next to him, she took the pacifier out of her mouth and tried to dip it into the water. But she quickly realized that even here the size of her small body did not allow her to wash the pacifier, and therefore she returned it back to her mouth. But after a moment, it dawned on her that if she couldn't wash the pacifier while sitting, then why not try lying down? Where, from the unexpected simplicity of the idea, she even dropped the pacifier. Having taken the desired position, Selena finally achieved her goal and lowered the pacifier into the pond. Having thoroughly rinsed her treasure, she took it out of the water and began to examine it closely, noting that the nipple was not very clean. At that moment, the voice of a man who silently approached from behind voiced the question of what was happening here. From surprise, Selena literally jumped on the spot, where her precious, almost washed pacifier flew out of her hands and landed at the feet of the uninvited guest. With all her might, the girl rushed to the place where her pacifier fell, where, taking it in her hands, she remembered the ancient rule, according to which if a fallen object lies on the ground for no more than 3 seconds, then it is not considered fallen. And the unexpected guest, who turned out to be a boy about 5 years old, asked the child what she was doing here. Having examined the boy, Selena noted that he looked very much like Edward Bennett. And besides, she had heard from the maids that he had a son. She also noted that, apparently, the character of this boy, who said that she should not be here, is much softer than the character of his father, because Edward Bennett was called a cold-blooded demon, capable of even going against his allies if necessary. He never dealt with fools, but even if a person was smart, then to communicate with Edward, he had to come from a noble family. And even if the great sorceress Selena turned out to be a commoner, he would despise her. Turning her thoughts back to the 5-year-old boy, she decided that she would take a look at what this scion of the Bennett family would eventually grow up to be. Thoughts about age carried Selena into dreams that when she turned 5 years old, she would be able to master lower-level circle spells, which would give her the opportunity to learn how to use more advanced techniques of magic. Because now she already knows what to do, she will just need to repeat it all. Where, first of all, she will learn to create various magical stones and jewelry, which will allow her to support herself independently. And then she will be able to use magic to escape from this hated house. Having thought about the prospects for the future, Selena decided to leave the boy and, just in case, wash the pacifier again, since for some reason the 3-second rule did not really inspire confidence in her. Having already gotten used to it, she quickly put her hand in the water and began to rinse the pacifier. But the boy was not at all embarrassed by the lack of attention in his direction from the child, and he came closer, which the girl did not really like. He apparently was worried about the fate of the child, because he began to say again that she could not come here, otherwise she would be kicked out. Selena remembered an incident in the Bennett family when a maid had her tendons cut and thrown out of the house just because she entered the garden without permission. She even remembered an incident that happened in the City of Magicians, where one of the magicians begged her on his knees not to take him with her to the Bennett house when she started visiting them. As soon as Edward said one word, all the magicians nearby began to shake in fear. Only Selena herself and that creature Malik were not afraid to meet him face to face, communicate, and even argue. Behind these thoughts, as well as plans for revenge on everyone, she finished washing the pacifier and put it back in her mouth. And the boy could not calm down, talking about how his father himself takes care of this garden, does not allow anyone to come here, and will be very angry if he finds out that the girl was here. Selena was very surprised that such a cold-blooded reptile like Edward could take care of the garden on his own. For some time, there was silence in the air, which was interrupted by the boy's words that his mother really liked this garden. Selena, depicting a very dissatisfied expression on her face, mentally answered that she was not going to listen to his snotty stories, and in general, she was not yet a baby who could not speak. And the boy continued, saying that his parents divorced after his father had a big fight with his mother. Maintaining the same expression on her face, Selena could only think that it was time for the boy to disappear from her field of vision. That didn't stop him from continuing to say now that he still loved his mother very much. And after these words, he suddenly sat down, hit his head, and saying that he really missed his mother and wanted to see her, began to cry. The girl's expression softened a little, but she still tried to convince herself that this boy was part of the Bennett family, and therefore should not be pitied at all. Then the boy raised his tear-stained eyes and said the word, "Mom." Looking at his face, Selina suddenly felt that it was very difficult for her to restrain her feelings, and noted the lack of a strict upbringing in the spirit of Edward. But having decided that she did not know how to calm children down, and that she could not speak now either, the girl got ready to leave the place of the unexpected meeting. Moving along the grass, she thought about how much her knees and palms, calloused from crawling, hurt. But from thoughts of pain and the fact that this pain would not leave her for a long time, Selina was distracted by the sound of approaching steps. She had no need for new meetings, and she decided not to tempt fate and waited out somewhere. The closest place to wait out danger was, of course, the bushes, where the girl found refuge with the possibility of viewing the path. The new possible counter turned out to be Edward himself. His appearance struck fear into the girl, who again remembered the maid's tendons and decided that the same fate awaited her if she were caught now. Trying not to make any noise, Selina decided to quickly escape from the impending threat. However, this could not be done silently, and Edward heard movement in the bushes. He looked intently in the direction from which the movement was heard, and he noted that the one who entered his garden turned out to be the same child in whom not only the blood of his family flows, but also the blood of ordinary people. In an instant, a terrible thought came to his head that it might be worth killing this child altogether, justifying himself by the fact that he did not see who was there in the bushes and mistook him for an intruder. But at the same moment, he imagined his father's reaction to such an excuse, where the Duke would definitely not believe it, knowing his son's mental abilities. From thoughts that his father was not a fool, Edward switched to thoughts that the garden should be put in order. Having moved a little further, the man suddenly saw his son Danny sitting on the ground, who immediately stood up at the sight of his father, hiding his tear-stained face and apologizing for entering his garden. Giving his son a look not typical of a tyrant, Edward said that the boy had done nothing wrong and could continue to come to the garden whenever he wanted. When his father asked if he was here alone, the boy admitted that just recently there had been a small child here, where this child washed that thing in the pond that they put in children's mouths. Edward was not very surprised by what the boy told him. He probably asked questions only to talk to his son. Patting the boy on the head with his hand and looking at his face, which showed that he had been crying recently, the man concluded that the boy missed his mother. Having no more questions for his son, Edward said that Danny could go if he wanted. But now the boy had questions where he asked his father if he would punish this child and throw him out of the house. Without giving an answer to this question, the man sent the boy away and thought about the fact that he did not remember raising his son so gentle, concluding that Danny took after his grandfather. And then his thoughts switched to the baby, where he wondered if the child himself could come such a long way just to wash his pacifier, whether it was an accident. The next day, Selina woke up in her crib as usual. Stretching, she noted that the pacifier felt much more pleasant in her mouth after she washed it. Suddenly, the girl realized that no one was coming to feed her, and yesterday she hadn't eaten anything all day either. She recalled that she had returned from the garden to the room unnoticed, but she did not at all remember that anyone had come to feed her. Suddenly, the thought came to her that they wanted to starve her, where perhaps the maid who received a scolding because of her decided to take revenge. Or it was Edward who found out that the child was in his garden and decided to kill the half-breed in this way. Selina sat carefully going through in her head all the possible options for what was happening and why none of the maids came to her. Periodically, the girl looked at the door in the hope that one of the maids would come in and feed her. Several hours passed like this, but no one appeared in the room, which led Selina into a state of panic. There was no longer any doubt that they had decided to kill her by starving her to death, but the girl decided that they would not succeed. She had gone through similar tests in her past life, and she could cope with this too. After some thought, she decided that first she would need to visit the garden of the scoundrel Edward, where on the bushes she managed to notice the presence of berries, which in her opinion should be edible. Concentrating, Selena called upon her magical powers in order to once again leave her crib and go to get food for herself. But only after landing on the floor did she feel severe pain in her palms and knees. That is, on those parts of the body that come into contact with surfaces when she crawls. However, there was nothing to do. She needed food, and, overcoming the pain, before visiting the garden, she went to look for the kitchen to quickly have something to eat, where along the way she continually had to hide from the maids, whose arrival she had recently been so looking forward to. Near one of the doors, the girl smelled the aromas of food. Taking a well-known position in which magical abilities were available to her, Selena concentrated, and the door opened under the influence of magical forces. Crawling inside, she wondered what the children even ate, where before she had only been given milk. But in principle, given the presence of a couple of front teeth, she could eat something stronger. The girl's sense of smell did not fail her, because she really found herself in the kitchen, which was simply filled with the most exquisite dishes. Seeing a cauldron with liquid and sensing a pleasant aroma, Selena assumed that there was soup there, but she immediately noted with regret that she did not yet know how to eat hot soup, and she needed to look for something else. Selena looked around, and suddenly her eyes found what she needed. Very close to her stood a wooden box with apples. Having looked at what the cooks were doing, who were now on a break and were sitting at the other end of the room, chatting about their own things, the girl decided to act. She quickly took a pose that opened access to magical abilities. And a moment later, 2 apples were already lying on the floor next to the box. But now a new problem arose, where it was necessary to somehow carry away these 2 apples. Selena attempted to stuff the apple under her clothes. However, this endeavor was a complete failure, since the apple did not fit under her small clothes and soon slipped out of her hands altogether. And suddenly, a great idea came to the girl's head, which made her face shine. She will definitely be able to carry away at least 1 apple, holding it between her 2 teeth. At some point along the way, her tired mouth could not stand it, and Selena dropped the apple on the floor. Then she decided to use magical power to carry the apple, where she needed to concentrate all the mana in her front teeth, and then she would not need to put in much physical effort. Having reached her room, Selena angrily noted that none of the maids had come, and that's how her first day of survival ended. 2 weeks have passed since that day, during which no one entered the room where the small child was, which didn't upset Selena too much, who managed to gather enough food for herself during this time and regularly replenished her supplies, thinking that an ordinary child in such conditions would have died long ago. After breakfast, she went for a walk, as she believed that she needed fresh air, and it wouldn't hurt to wash her pacifier once again. With joy, she once again went into the garden, where she could always pick up a lot of food. Having reached the fruit-bearing plants, Selena discovered that the stems with berries had been cut off, deciding that this was done by Edward on purpose. Suddenly, she heard a cry that was already familiar to her, which irritated her when she heard it for the first time, and no less irritates her now. She noted without pleasure that she had bumped into Edward's son again. Not wanting to meet, Selena simply decided to crawl past, but Danny noticed the child and came closer, asking what she was doing here. Sitting down on the grass with a not very happy expression on her face, the girl thought about how stupid this boy was, asking questions to a small child who couldn't answer them because he couldn't talk yet. Straining her memory, for some reason the girl tried to remember the name of this boy. But not remembering, she abandoned this idea and crawled to the reservoir, where she began to rinse the pacifier, and Danny followed her to the reservoir. The proposal from the boy to wash the pacifier was a complete surprise for Selena. She looked into his clean and kind eyes and saw an open palm, waiting for a pacifier to be placed in it. And the girl did not keep herself waiting long, passing her pacifier to the boy. If someone were to watch from the side, they would see an amusing sight. A baby and a 5-year-old boy standing opposite each other on all fours, where the latter receives a pacifier from the baby. Having received the pacifier, Danny began to wash it, noting out loud that the pacifier was very dirty and difficult to wash, to which the child, if he could, said, but only thought that there was nothing surprising, because she had probably not been washed for years. But soon the boy handed the child a clean pacifier. Sitting down next to him on the grass, he smiled and said that he was glad to help, And at that time, Selena, putting a pacifier in her mouth, reasoned that a 5-year-old boy, of course, is stronger than a baby, and it is easier for him to wash the pacifier. Then the boy started talking again about how the child shouldn't come here so often. But Selena no longer listened to him, heading back to her room, upset that she was unable to pick berries today. But the boy suddenly stood up and followed her, which completely discouraged her. The girl stopped and turned around in order to figure out how to tell this annoying boy to stay away from her. But at that very moment, a piercing scream was heard above their heads, causing both children to flinch. And after the sound, the one who made it appeared, a huge griffin. Selena was amazed at how a griffin could have come from here, which should only live in Mediterranean ruins. She knew very well that despite his size, he only hunts small animals and could very well attack a child. So with the thought that they needed to run away, she desperately thrashed her small hand against the boy's leg. Not understanding what was the matter, the boy asked the child what happened. And Selena, deciding that she had already done too much for him, rushed into the bushes at top speed. At that very moment, the Duke appeared in the garden, loudly indignant at the appearance of a griffin on their estate. And the girl watched the appearance of Dorian, accompanied by servants, already hiding behind a tree. Completely stunned by what they saw, the men stood staring at the sky, not believing that the griffin was here. Selena also turned her gaze to the formidable predator. Suddenly, the griffin changed the trajectory of its movement and sharply rushed down. He chose as his target a little boy who did not know what to do in such a situation. A familiar voice behind him, calling the boy, made him turn around joyfully. Without hesitation, Danny ran up to his father and hugged him. Selena looked in amazement at the love with which Edward treated his son, and caught herself thinking that she had not thought about the presence of such a side to this tyrant. Having sent the boy to his grandfather, Edward went out to duel with the griffin, declaring that non-entities like him tend to go astray, but he will now show him the right direction. Selena, watching from her safe place, remembered the rumors about Edward's power, where they said that he can masterfully handle any type of weapon. There was also a rumor that he had found some very powerful artifact in the ruins. Remembering all this, the girl decided that there was nothing to be afraid of, since such a warrior was here, and decided to leave. And Edward, at the same moment, made a sharp lunge towards the griffin, clutching a spear ready to strike in his hand. The distance was too great, and the griffin perfectly saw the danger of such a rapprochement. The blow was struck, but the beast easily dodged it, soaring into the air. Observing everything that was happening, the Duke finally expressed his indignation at what they were doing in the magic tower, since the griffins broke out of the ruins. The words about the tower made Selena freeze in place, because she immediately remembered that the magicians of the tower had the most artifacts. Edward, turning to his father, began to express his assumptions regarding the appearance of the griffin, where, in his opinion, this angry beast simply lost its owner. Selena listened sadly to what Edward said. After all, by the owner of the terrible beast, he meant her, the one who died. These words hurt the girl greatly, and bowing her head, she quietly crawled to her room, where it was easy for her to leave unnoticed, since everyone was busy with the griffin. Selena reached the mansion quite quickly and without incident or unwanted encounters. As she walked through its long and sometimes gloomy corridors, she mentally wondered why the magicians had stopped monitoring the ruins. After all, the griffin comes from ruins that are under the control of the tower, and its presence here means that there are some problems in the tower. The ruins have existed since ancient times, as have the magical beasts that live there. Also stored in the ruins are objects known as artifacts, which are sources of powerful magic. Some artifacts are capable of controlling people, others may defend them, and still others may curse. Everyone wants to get at least one artifact, because its owner becomes much stronger. Selena summed up her thoughts. The problem is to find the artifact, where you need to enter the ruins and go down an endless staircase. On the way to get the artifact, the seeker will encounter many magical animals, for example, the same griffin. In the world today, only 7 artifacts are known, and there are only 37 ruins, where those who want to increase their strength regularly leave their lives. Crawling from step to step, Selena recalled that the tower currently owns 3 artifacts, 2 of which are dark, 1 is light. Light artifacts contain sacred energy, and dark ones contain the opposite, evil energy. There are only 2 light artifacts in this empire, one of which is in the Bennett family. Another artifact is located in the Imperial Palace itself. With thoughts that the 2 remaining of the 7 artifacts were in the empire beyond the seas, that Malik did not care at all about managing the tower, and finally, that her mood had completely deteriorated, Selena reached her room. She decided that she needed to sleep so that the sad thoughts would go away. But before that, she should eat. She couldn't help but think about how Danny met his savior father. And moving towards the food, Selena noted with envy that, in general, it's quite good when there is someone to save you. And finally, she got to her food. The girl's mood improved dramatically when the berries were in her hands. Some noise on the street made her look away from her meal for a second. But having concluded that they were simply trying to subdue the Griffin, Selena returned to her berries. A huge shadow covered her entire small body completely unexpectedly. While she turned around, the girl heard the words of the men on the street that the Griffin was heading towards the mansion. Turning around completely, Selena discovered with horror that the Griffin was standing right in front of the window of her room, and decided that now she was definitely finished. Griffins cannot tell the difference between animals, magical beasts, and humans, but have keen eyesight and sense of smell. And the red color, which is now smeared all over the girl's mouth, is their favorite, as it symbolizes blood. Taking just one step forward, the beast found itself inside the room, shattering the glass. But suddenly one great idea came into the girl's little head, which could promise salvation if everything worked out. She quickly walked towards her pile of fruit supplies, where, she remembered exactly, the blue berries were located. The blue color means that they are not yet ripe, and if they are mixed with the leaves, they will create a smell that griffins hate and are weakened by it for a while. Holding berries and leaves in her hands, she looked at the beast, and the griffin looked at her. Realizing that she could wait no longer, Selena, with all her childish strength, began to crush and rub the berries and leaves between her palms. And the appearance of the desired smell was not long in coming. As expected, the predator did not like the smell at all, causing him to wince. However, the griffin did not even think of flying away from the hated smell, but on the contrary began to approach its source. And now his open-clawed paw was ready to grab the child's head. Realizing that death could not be avoided, Selena closed her eyes, preparing to die again. But suddenly, someone's strong blow opened the doors of the room. Saying that the griffin was a waste of his time, Edward appeared in the room, throwing his spear at the beast. It all ended instantly. The predator was defeated by an even more dangerous and powerful predator. Selena first looked at the dead griffin, then moved her gaze a little further, where her crushed food lay on the floor, which she took so long to collect, which made her furious. Edward folded his arms over his chest, noticing a child sitting not far from the griffin he had defeated. After looking a little at the baby, who was lamenting the food that had become unusable, the man told her that she was like a cockroach. This treatment greatly hurt Selena, and her hands even shook nervously, thinking about how he even dares to address her like that. The baby and the man fixed their piercing gazes on each other, where one could read rage and the other contempt. The silence was broken by the voice of the Duke, who finally reached the premises. The cry of his father, who was interested in the fate of the griffin, forced Edward to look away and turn around. But at that moment, Dorian saw a child sitting on the floor and asked what this little girl was doing here. And Selena sat and thought about where else she should be, except in her room. The overall picture looked rather strange. 2 adult men and a small child next to a griffin defeated by a spear. Looking at the men, the girl silently wondered why they were still standing here, because the danger had passed and the child could again be left to the mercy of fate. When asked by his father why this room looked so terrible, Edward, arrogantly crossing his arms over his chest, suggested that it might be due to the fact that the commoner Margaret had previously lived here, which made the Duke literally clutch his head at the arrogant antics of his son. Meanwhile, Selena, no longer paying attention to the men, approached her crushed fruits and berries, trying to choose what to eat. Seeing this, the Duke flew into a rage, shouting that no matter what, this child had Bennett blood in him, and the girl must be treated as such. Turning to the butler, the Duke ordered all the maids to be brought here immediately. Edward added his own remark, saying that there was no need to be angry with the maids for not looking after the half-breed, to which Dorian said that it was better for Edward to remain silent, since William was his son. And in front of them on the floor, the daughter of Edward's brother was collecting some scraps. Such words could not go unnoticed by a little girl with the mind of an adult woman. After his father's words, Edward squinted at the child, after which he suddenly said strange words that time moves forward, everything changes, and the father changes too, becoming softer every day. Then the man, presenting his garden, told the child that he knew that it was she who stole his berries. Edward came closer and extended his hand to the baby. Assuming that the man would now grab her to deal with her, the half-breed once and for all, Selina decided not to wait. With deft and quick movements, rolls and somersaults, she ran away from the hands that, as she thought, would now destroy her. Satisfied with herself, she cast a victorious glance at the surprised man, and Edward, for some reason, didn't even think about catching up with her. Instead, he looked at the girl and suddenly asked his father what her name was. The question took Dorian by surprise, because he did not know the name of his own granddaughter. Listening to this dialogue, Selina thought that in general it was good that the previous owner of this body did not hear the conversation of these cruel men, but she really needed some kind of new name. Just at that moment, Parsons returned to the room, bringing all the maids. Giving them a menacing look, the Duke asked which of them was responsible for looking after this child. Meanwhile, the girl decided to leave this room, where too many people had already gathered, and crawled up to the maids standing in the aisle, looking for where she could crawl through. Without waiting for an answer from the maids, the Duke asked the butler if the child had been assigned a permanent maid. Parsons replied that there was one nanny, but she suddenly quit in the middle of the workday. Selina noticed that the butler speaks very calmly and is not at all worried when communicating with the gentleman, which indicates his long service to this house. And Adrian continued to look at the child crawling around the room, which Selina didn't like at all, who was only thinking about running away from here and couldn't understand why the Duke's son was staring at her like that. The Duke himself, pointing to the scraps of fruit and berries lying behind him, asked the question if any of the servants knew how a small child was able to get all this. Bowing their heads and adopting submissive poses, the maids, all as one, quietly said that they did not know the answer to the Duke's question. Then Dorian asked another question about when any of the servants were interested in the life of this child and visited the girl in this room. While the maids took turns answering that one was here a month ago, another 2 months ago, a third 3 weeks ago, and so on, Selina thought about what exactly made them not lie, but tell the truth. Such answers led the Duke into amazement and real rage, where he could not believe that the child, who had just learned to crawl, had not even been fed by anyone for more than 2 weeks. He frantically shouted that the maids had gone crazy for doing this, and all they could do was lament that they had sinned and were admitting guilt in everything. And the girl, in turn, noted that the Duke himself also did not particularly remember the well-being of his granddaughter, since the current situation itself takes place. In addition, Selina suddenly felt how hungry she was, not having had time to eat anything. And then the Duke turned his attention to the butler, declaring that he is in charge of the servants here and should more closely monitor how the maids work, slapping him in the face. Parsons accepted the master's anger with dignity, saying that yes, he was also guilty of what happened. Turning to everyone, Dorian again asked what the child had been doing these 2 weeks. Selina mentally answered his question, saying that she did not notice this time, surviving and getting food for herself. A sensible thought came to her suddenly, as always. While everyone is gathered in one room and decides who is to blame for the fact that the child was left to starve to death, she can run into the garden and finally have a snack. And the treasured door opening the way to food was not locked. With thoughts of freedom and food, Selina headed towards the exit. Someone's strong hand interrupted her forward movement, pulling her back and up. It was Edward who finally caught the child and turned with the girl in his hand to his father, who was now asking the servants how and where the child was able to find food. His son answered this question, explaining that the girl was stealing berries and fruits from his garden. This statement once again caused a violent reaction from the Duke, after which he asked the question, "How old is this child?" Hearing the number 11 months, the Duke thought seriously and could not believe that a child at that age was so smart as to get out of the room on his own and get his own food. The Duke's son fixed his gaze on the child in his hand, but tired of the constantly twitching girl, Edward put her back on the floor, calling her a dirty creature. Having received freedom, Selina moved forward with the thought that she would have to take revenge on the man for his words and actions. But before she had time to crawl even a couple of meters, she saw another hand in a white glove reaching out to her. It was the Duke himself who tried to raise the child, but he failed to do so, since Selina did not wait until she was caught again and crawled away. Looking at the angry baby, Dorian noted out loud that she was very agile for her age. He then turned to the butler, saying that it was unacceptable to leave the child to live in such conditions, and gave him instructions to assign the girl a new room and new maids. Parsons approached the child with open arms and told her to come to him. The prudent Selina thought that if she established a relationship with the butler, she could always count on good food. After which she looked at Edward and came to the conclusion that he did not plan to kill her yet. And so, after weighing all the pros and cons, she finally made up her mind and allowed the butler to take her in his arms. The Duke was surprised that the girl, who had just run away from literally everyone, so easily allowed herself to be picked up by the butler. Trying to shout a complaint towards the Duke that he was staring at her, Selina, who could not control her speech, shouted the word "Dad." The Duke did not hear or pretended not to hear what the child said, addressing the child a question about what she just said. Instead of the girl, the butler answered, who confirmed that she said the word "Dad." She herself was embarrassed by what she said. Selina tried to shout something, and she succeeded, this time a whole phrase in which someone present was addressed that he was a fool. Edward was quick to note with sarcasm that he, of course, did not know what his father heard, but it seemed to him that the child shouted some kind of curse. But judging by the expression on Dorian's face, he didn't really like his son's sarcasm. Without answering his son's words, the Duke turned to the butler with a question whether he happened to know the girl's name. Parsons replied that if he was not mistaken, the girl's name was Cheryl, and Selina, being in the butler's arms, felt all the fatigue of the day falling on her. A moment later, she fell asleep, dropping her favorite pacifier on the floor. The Duke stood and silently looked at the sleeping child, who had suffered over the past 2 weeks. Edward, who instilled fear in everyone, paid no less attention to the girl, where the sight of a small, sleeping child brought back memories of his own son Danny at the same age. The Duke, also already quite softened, agreed with his son's conclusions, and Edward, who valued intelligence and intelligence in people, suddenly approached the child and, touching the girl on the head, said that this child had a bright head, since she was able to wander around the mansion unattended and not die of hunger. Taking her small hand, he noted the presence of calluses and many wounds on it, apparently from rose thorns. The man was struck by the thought that the girl's resourcefulness was a simple coincidence of circumstances. Deciding that his son was heading for something bad, Dorian called out to him. But Edward was not going to do anything bad, saying that he was also to blame for the current circumstances, since he also did nothing, and asked his father not to raise his voice in vain. And then his gaze rushed to the direction where the maids, gathered by the butler, continued to stand. Throwing his forlorn look at them, he said loudly that they allowed a child, whose last name was Bennett, to starve and live without proper supervision, which was absolutely unacceptable. After which he turned his attention to Parsons, saying that if he did not want problems, he should monitor the maids more carefully, to which the butler responded with a submissive bow. Having finished threatening the servants, Edward turned to his father, saying that he would now go to Danny, who had been crying constantly lately, and try to calm him down a little. The Duke also instructed the butler, in addition to preparing a new room and appointing a new nurse, it was also necessary to invite a doctor to examine the child. For some reason, the request to invite a doctor surprised the butler, but the Duke confirmed that Parsons had heard everything correctly. The girl should be examined by a doctor. Then Dorian looked again at his little granddaughter sleeping peacefully. And he also left the half-destroyed room, where the Griffin, defeated by his son, continued to lie on the floor. A new summer day had arrived, and the birds were chirping cheerfully in the garden outside the windows of the huge mansion. Selina finally woke up, yawning deeply. Getting up, she saw some new woman who joyfully announced that little miss had finally woken up. Not finding his pacifier, the child, out of habit of holding something in his mouth, used his own finger instead of a pacifier, and then a pacifier appeared in the woman's hands, which was accompanied by the assumption that the child was probably looking for it. In a matter of seconds, the pacifier was already in the baby's mouth. Selina suggested that she most likely missed her pacifier when she fell fast asleep. And then she remembered her past life, where the powerful sorceress Selina never slept at all. Trying to shout out her own name, Selina noted that her pronunciation seemed to have improved noticeably. However, what the woman heard clearly left her completely confused. And a second later, she was already wiping tears from her face, saying that she was not the girl's mother. Looking at the crying woman, Selina could not understand what had suddenly happened to her, never realizing that she had shouted out the word mom instead of her name. But then the girl switched her attention from the woman to the situation in the room, where she noted that it was very clean, beautiful, and her crib seemed to be even larger than the previous one. The only thing she couldn't understand now was why she still had the old pacifier. While she was looking at it, taking it out of her mouth, the woman, as if understanding the girl's thoughts, said that she would, of course, buy her a new pacifier. But she began to sob again and added that money was no longer allocated for the girl, where this woman's crying was already beginning to greatly irritate Selina. Suddenly, the woman asked the child to scream more often, if anything, because if it was too quiet, she might think that something had happened. The next strange gesture was that the woman suddenly decided to introduce herself to the child, saying that her name was Sabrina. And Selina sat, and with the appropriate expression on her face, thought that she was not at all interested in anything that was voiced by this strange woman, where she could simply say that she would not buy a pacifier because she had no money. The girl immediately remembered that in her past life she had a lot of jewelry, but there was an agreement that in the event of her death, all the jewelry should be transferred to the foundation of the Society of Magicians. However, as a precaution, she had the idea to hide some jewelry and magic stones around the world. The question now is how to get to your hiding places. Deciding that she needed to force this maid to go out with her to the street, where she could figure out how to get to the hiding places, Selina stood up and attracted her attention by shouting the word market. The woman was very surprised that a child who was only 12 months old wanted to go to the market. Selina was ready to rage because of this misunderstanding and the stupidity of the woman, who for some reason was surprised that the child needed to go to the market. But then the maid said that she could take her to the market if the girl were not forbidden to leave the mansion. Hearing this, Selina immediately came to the conclusion that it was the tyrant Edward who gave the order prohibiting her from leaving the mansion as revenge for eating berries and fruits from his garden. And the woman continued, saying that it is not in vain that they say that puppies are trained from birth, and from that moment on she will begin to train the child. What she heard made Selina literally sit up and look at the strange woman in bewilderment. She saw that the maid clearly had something wrong with her eyes and facial expressions in general. In a past life, an experienced and powerful sorceress, Selina knew that to practice black magic, it is necessary to be fed with negative emotions, and therefore she communicated with many disgusting people and senses them immediately. And this maid just smelled of negative energy. Realizing that her salvation was to attract the attention of strangers, Selina began to scream as hard as she could. However, the evil woman, calling the girl to silence, instantly covered her mouth with a pacifier. Selina felt that the nipple now somehow began to fit too tightly to her head, where it turned out that the chain installed on the pacifier was not so that the pacifier would not be lost or dirty, falling to the floor if it suddenly falls out of the mouth, but in order to secure it tightly to the head. With horror, the girl noted that now she could not pull out the pacifier. And if the situation repeats, where everyone abandons her and does not carry food, then she will definitely die. And the clearly abnormal woman continued, saying that today they would learn silence, and the child would turn out to be a delightful puppy. The maid, clearly pleased with herself, finally declared that she was the best in her business. Deciding not to wait for further developments, and with the thought that the maid did not understand who she had contacted at all, Selina began to concentrate. The appearance of bright rays around the child left the woman confused, where after their occurrence, the child suddenly rose into the air, which led the crazy woman into complete delight, where she joyfully concluded that it was so cool when her puppy could fly. Selina's thoughts were that she needed to somehow get to the garden, and if the maid follows her, then Edward will catch her in the garden, and then her days here are numbered. With all her might, the girl headed towards the exit, and the maid, with her strange expression on her face, which did not bode well, followed the child. Suddenly, Selina was struck by the thought that this maid was also part of Edward's revenge for the fact that she was in charge of his garden. She crawled as fast as she could, but the abnormal maid was getting closer. Her voice, saying that the puppy was behaving badly and would be punished, was literally behind Selina's back. At that moment, right in the direction of their movement, the girl saw a male silhouette. Edward Bennett himself was moving towards them. She had nothing to lose, and she rushed forward, leaving Edward behind too. The cherished door to freedom was very close, and Selina hoped that she could slip through without being caught. But then someone interrupted her movement, grabbing her by the collar of her clothes, where the girl prayed that it was not an abnormal maid. Her expectations were fulfilled because Edward caught her. At the same time, the owner of the mansion, Duke Dorian, appeared here and was greeted by his son. Meanwhile, Edward took the girl in his arms, like caring parents take a child. Examining the child, he carefully ran his finger along the chain on the girl's head. The Duke asked what was going on here. Ignoring his father's question, Edward continued to stare at the child, which made Selina feel increasingly uneasy. The maid, who had been silent until then, finally also raised her voice, expressing surprise that all the gentlemen were gathered here. Now turning to the maid, Dorian asked why this child was here. Apologizing for what happened, the maid explained that she only turned away for a second, which was enough for the restless child to run away. Such an unceremonious lie greatly angered Selina, who at the same time did not understand why Edward continued to hold her in his arms. Here the tyrant also inserted his word, declaring that he perfectly remembers that he ordered this maid to take good care of the girl, turning to the woman with the title Baroness Sabrina Stone. Sabrina bowed her head in confirmation of what had been said, and Selina was very surprised that she had a whole baroness as her caregiver. The baroness then began to claim that she was taking more than excellent care of the girl, that she was watching her constantly, and that this would not happen again. Seeing the look of the crazy woman and hearing the tone with which these words were spoken to her, Selina noted to herself that now she would even pin her to the bed, because the question was no longer simply a matter of life and death. And in her personal pride, Selina decided that it was necessary to put a curse on the baroness using black magic, which would require a large amount of mana. Everyone knows that white magic comes from nature, where the greater its source, the greater its power. But in order to use this magic, you need to train for a long time. But black magic was invented by people, where its source is their own evil intentions and grievances, thanks to which, even without outstanding abilities, you can become a very powerful wizard. Selina concluded that now she is just a child who knows magic, but for the use of magic, both white and black, you always need to pay something, and she had no idea how she would have to pay in this situation. Of course, the risk was great, because this small body may not withstand the use of black magic. As a result, the girl decided to limit herself to the curse for now, and only then deal with everything else. The child's thoughts were interrupted by the words of Edward, who stated that this child seemed very curious to him. Raising her gaze to the man, Selina could not understand why this tyrant was smiling so much, and the Duke's son was already reaching out with his hand to the child's head, thinking out loud about what could be happening in this girl's little head. Slowly he touched the chain on the child's head again, and at that very moment, the links in the chain broke as if by magic. For now, not understanding what was happening, Baroness Stone simply silently watched Edward's actions, who had already managed to take the pacifier out of the child's mouth. after which he suddenly turned his attention to the baroness, declaring that if the devil exists, he is now standing before him in the guise of Sabrina. Throwing away the pacifier, he asked the baroness a question about who was to blame for the current situation. The pacifier, making a corresponding sound, fell to the floor, and only now did Selina pay attention to this, opening her eyes wide in surprise. She was already very accustomed to her pacifier, and therefore did not make everyone wait long for her reaction to the fact that the pacifier was taken away from her. Then the Duke intervened, saying that the baby apparently needed a pacifier. He came closer, bent down, and picked up the pacifier from the floor, immediately returning it to the girl's mouth, who was not at all opposed to the nipple being in her mouth again, despite the fact that it had just been on the floor. The Duke looked in amazement at the child, who made some feelings awaken in him. Selina was just thinking about why everyone was looking at her like that. It seemed that with every second, Dorian was looking more and more closely at the child. But his thoughts were now not about the child, but about the fact that a chain was attached to the pacifier. Selina was tired of such attention, and she decided not to pay attention to it, closing her eyes. Meanwhile, the Baroness decided to remind herself, saying that she did not quite understand what Edward meant when he spoke about who was to blame for what happened. At this, the Duke's son gave her a look that sent a chill down Sabrina's spine. Pointing to the chain, he asked the woman to explain what it was. The Baroness answered without a twinge of conscience that this was a device for educational purposes. Edward then asked her to explain exactly what these educational goals were. This man's reaction was surprising to Selina, where she concluded that it was clearly not him who forced the Baroness to mock her. Sabrina explained that the child was very mischievous and misbehaved, and therefore, before it was too late, in this way she tried to teach the girl discipline. The blatant lie drove Selina crazy, and she, taking out a pacifier, began to scream heart-rendingly, trying to shout out that she wanted to finish off this liar. She continued to scream and tried to tell her to let her go so that she could deal with the Baroness properly. Looking at this abnormal woman, Selina deeply regretted that she could not kill her right now, and Edward watched in amazement at the child's violent reaction to the woman's words. He understood that this smart child beyond his years could not just have such a reaction. Selina was upset to the point of tears that she was now so helpless, and all events were not developing the way she wanted. Suddenly, the Duke's son dropped to one knee and placed the child on the floor. Without hesitation, Selina quickly headed towards the direction where the woman stood, thinking about how she could take revenge on her right now. Shouting that this vile creature in the face of a child should not approach her, the Baroness raised her hand, apparently intending to hit the child. But at the same moment, Edward menacingly said that she would be in trouble if she now tried to move even an inch, and their family name would never again appear in the lists of the imperial aristocracy. These words had their effect and brought Sabrina into a stupor, forcing her to freeze and slowly lower her hand. And Edward continues to drill into the woman with his cold-blooded gaze. Seeking protection from the head of the family, Baroness Stone expressed displeasure to the Duke that such threats from his son were unacceptable. But the Duke was not merciful to her either, saying that she had crossed all boundaries. The behavior of the Bennett family members today never ceased to amaze Selina, who had no idea that they could so zealously protect a half-breed, and she was already wondering what would happen next. The heated Baroness suddenly announced that the Bennett family constantly gives their family only dirty and low positions, to which Edward replied that it was up to him to decide what was dirty and low and what was not. And Selina thought that now Sabrina was dealing with a real predator in the person of the Duke's son. We're now let Baroness Stone feel like a victim. Approaching the Baroness, Edward declared that he hated two-faced and stupid people. He ordered her to return to his estate, lock all the windows, doors, and draw the curtains too, so that from today, no one would hear anything more about the Stone family. This order made the Baroness's legs give way, and she sat down directly on the floor. With difficulty gathering her strength, the woman asked how long such an order would last, to which Edward replied that until the Bennett family disappears from the face of the earth. One could argue with any other family, but the Bennett family was so powerful that it was rumored that the Emperor himself bowed to them. In addition, their family was never known for its kindness, where people who crossed their path disappeared forever. Edward immediately added that, of course, the baroness might not listen to him. He was not forcing her to do anything at all. But the baroness knew that what was said was an order hidden behind the advice, and therefore she quietly obeyed. Turning to one of the maids, the Duke's son told her to accompany the baroness. Selina, sitting on the floor, noted that Edward was very cruel now. But what the Duke's son did does not at all negate the fact that she has her own revenge planned. To create the curse, she needs to find straw, 12 rose thorns, and the hair of the baroness, where she decided that her hair would most likely be found in the room. A man's voice made the child flinch and be distracted from his thoughts. It was the Duke who approached her and asked what the child was doing. He took the girl in his arms and began to examine her wounded hands. Selina remembered that in her previous life, she had very weak skin and was constantly injured. However, she decided that the presence of wounds was not a reason to feel sorry for her and began to scream, thereby making it clear that she wanted to go back to the floor. Trying to calm the girl down, the Duke shook her up and down, which made her feel very dizzy. She calmed down, trying to control her nausea, and the Duke noted, "Which is good at calming children down." Then he, swearing on their family name, said that he would no longer allow the child to suffer and would assign the best servants to look after her. That stern old man whom Selina once knew suddenly disappeared somewhere, and his voice sounded very caring. Now she began to feel that she was very tired of the lady who was assigned to her, and her eyelids began to get heavy again, closing her eyes. The gentle rocking of the Duke's hands and his whispering did their job, and very soon his granddaughter was already asleep. He ordered the butler to find one among the maids who has experience in raising children and assign her to his granddaughter. Edward just stood nearby all this time and greatly surprised his father by not even once making a sarcastic comment. The Duke asked him about this unusual behavior, to which Edward said that he decided that everything should take its course. It was unusual that his son had no objections, but of course this state of affairs pleased the old Duke. Another day was in full swing. There was a man in the room in a white coat and glasses. He leaned over the cradle where the Duke's granddaughter slept and listened to the rhythms of her heartbeat. Dorian, standing behind, asked the doctor how his granddaughter was doing. Having completed the examination, the doctor turned to the Duke, remaining silent. The frightened man hurried the doctor to tell everything as it is about the state of his granddaughter's health, and the doctor said that the girl was developing more slowly than her peers, and it was clear that she was not eating well. Meanwhile, the girl was sleeping and did not hear that they were discussing her at all times. The Duke and Edward stood and silently listened to the doctor's report on the results of the examination of the child. Then the man stated that despite everything that had happened, the girl, surprisingly, was completely healthy, which caused the Duke to exhale with relief. The doctor further expressed his surprise that the child independently found food for 2 weeks. But this was not the main thought that now occupied his mind. What impressed him more was that now 2 members of the Bennett family were standing in front of him, worried about the health of their illegitimate child. This was surprising because there were numerous instances throughout history where this family expelled those who did not fit into their standards. The baby is the daughter of the Count's son, so his visit can still be explained somehow, but the doctor did not understand what his son Edward was doing here. Officially, Dorian Bennett has 3 children, with his daughter Emma being the eldest. His second child was his eldest son Edward, and the third was the youngest son Edward. This entire trio of direct heirs did not get along with each other at all, and constantly competed. The doctor continued that all symptoms of malnutrition will disappear if the child eats normally. So the man noted that the girl had many injuries from crawling on concrete, stones, and other surfaces, where now every movement must be very painful for her. And if the family cannot ensure that the child does not crawl on hard surfaces, it is necessary to quickly teach the child to walk. But then the head of the family stopped the doctor's speech, saying that this was no longer his concern. In an authoritative tone that made the doctor bow his head, the Duke ordered that the doctor should visit the child regularly, monitoring her growth and health. Night fell, where the outlines of the mansion were illuminated every now and then by the moon peeking out from behind the clouds. Rays of moonlight fell into the new room of the Duke's granddaughter, faintly illuminating it. The inhabitant of this room herself did not even think of spending the night sleeping. Selina was busy creating the damned doll, to which she had already added the hair of Baroness Stone she found on the floor. The job was done, which could not but please the sorceress, because it took her a whole week, where she had to wait for long hours for the new maid assigned to her to leave the room, so that there is an opportunity to leave the room and start collecting the necessary materials to create the cursed doll. Crawling now became less painful for her because knee pads made of stiffer fabric were sewn to her clothes. The new maid also made a necklace for the pacifier, rather than a chain that would lock the baby's mouth. And now there was no need to be afraid of losing the pacifier or getting it dirty by dropping it on the floor. Looking at the doll, Selina noted that, of course, it was made a little sloppily, but it would be suitable for a curse, where all that was left was to drop your blood into it, supply the doll with magical energy, and then burn it. Squeezing the cursed doll in her hands, the girl concentrated with all her might, calling upon her magical powers and beginning to saturate the doll with her magical energy. Gradually, the image before her eyes began to blur more and more, and now the little child, inside of whom lived an experienced witch, was already sleeping. The moonlight falling through the window of the Duke's granddaughter's room had long been replaced by the rays of the sun. The chirping of birds outside the window woke up the little witch, but before she had time to open her eyes, she found herself in the arms of her new maid. But the woman did not hold the child in her arms for long, and as soon as she took the girl out of the crib, she immediately lowered her to the floor, giving her freedom of movement. Selina, who had not yet fully woken up, tried to figure out and remember what she was doing so important yesterday. Help with the memories came unexpectedly from the maid, where she, showing the child a straw doll, asked with a smile where it came from. Stretching her hands up, Selina made it clear to the maid that she wanted the doll to be returned to her immediately. But the kind girl, hiding the scary doll behind her hands, suggested that the child sew a bear instead of the doll. Of course, such a proposal was completely unacceptable for the witch, who spent so much time and effort creating this damned doll, and she had no choice but to throw a tantrum, which immediately gave its results, as the girl with a good-natured smile returned the child's toy. After which, with the most caring and good-natured look, Mary, that was the name of the maid, told the girl not to cry. Saying the kindest and most affectionate words, the maid carefully lifted the girl, clutching the hellish doll in her hands, into her arms. And at that moment, Selina felt that she felt very strange when this kind girl took her in her arms. She recalled that in her previous life, she had not felt as much human warmth as she felt during this short time spent with Mary. Selina came to the conclusion that perhaps for this reason, the maid's touch seemed so unusual to her. She was very pleased with this new feeling, although it was completely unusual for her. Mary noted out loud that the girl had a very scary face when she demanded that the doll be returned, which was probably a consequence of the loneliness of the child who became attached to the doll. The embittered sorceress Selina was surprised that in such a short period of time, this simple girl understood so much about her, where Mary thought the Duke's granddaughter was a delightfully sweet creature. Continuing to surprise Selina, the maid invited her to go outside and take a walk. This was a great idea that made the child happy, because walking in the sun is always good. A luxurious table was set right outside, at which members of the Bennett family were sitting. One of them was Danny, who asked the child what she was doing, and Dorian, sitting at the same table, noted to himself that it was quite strange that the child still could not speak. Hearing once again a discussion of her shortcomings, Selina grimaced with displeasure. Then she noticed the tea set on the table and remembered that in a past life she had ordered the same one for herself, but did not have time to receive it. And now she was very interested in who received it instead of her. Dorian tried to call his granddaughter into his arms. Looking at this invitation, Selina realized that she would not be able to always avoid being picked on. Therefore, the damned doll that was with her had to be hidden, which is what she did, turning in the opposite direction from the inviter, which greatly surprised him. Squeezing the doll, Selina thought that Dorian had seen a lot in life and would immediately understand what it was, deciding that the child was abnormal. Or even worse, he will think that the girl stole the doll from Edward, which will cast the shadow of a black magic trainee on him. While she was crawling and thinking about all this, the Duke called her to him again, calling her by name Cheryl. Realizing that there was no time at all, she quickly shoved the damned doll into the bushes. And after a couple of seconds, she found herself in the hands of the Duke Bennett's grandson, who had approached, deciding that this would save her from the need to be in the hands of the Duke himself. Selina didn't really want to feel helpless in his hands once again. She understood perfectly well that Dorian would simply pass by her if she had been reborn as some kind of commoner. And anyway, witches never really got along with knights like this Duke. Selina and the Duke's thoughts were interrupted by Danny's exclamation, who joyfully asked if Cheryl was his little sister. The Duke did not find an answer to such an unexpected question and remained meaningfully silent. Selina threw a glance towards Dorian, saying that she certainly knew the answer to the question posed by the boy. And then the boy looked at the girl and asked why she was so nervous. Considering that the question was clearly not a smart one, Selina mentally answered it by saying that anyone would be nervous if they knew that a cursed doll was hidden a couple of meters away, which somehow still needed to be taken away. And then the night Selina had long awaited arrived. She never managed to pick up the doll from the bushes during the day, and she went for it in the dead of night. She really liked the new pads on her knees, with which she was no longer afraid of getting hurt and generally felt very good crawling. Now she has learned to open doors with her magic without much effort and from any position. Therefore, quite quickly she reached the garden, where she spent the day in the company of members of the Bennett family and took her damned doll. She had already returned to the mansion and was looking for a place to burn the doll to complete the curse when a voice called out to her, calling her by name Salil. Turning around, Selina saw a sleepy Danny standing in front of her, clutching a pillow to himself. He sat down on the floor next to the child, and his eyes seemed very sad and tired to Selina. She suddenly felt very sorry for this boy, whom she had seen crying so often. She crawled closer, stood up on her little legs, and stroked his hair, which greatly surprised her son Edward. Not knowing how to react, the boy looked at the small child, who apparently understood his feelings. And to Selina, he suddenly seemed like a small, frightened dog who needed to be protected and stroked. And suddenly, Danny said that he missed his mother very much and began to cry again. And the little girl looked at him with her understanding gaze, but did not know how and with what she could help him. She simply closed her eyes and continued to stroke the boy. At some point, the Duke's grandson suddenly raised his head and asked the child if she missed her mother. Thinking that this couldn't happen in principle, since she didn't remember her parents, Selina, deciding that the boy had calmed down, decided to continue her search for a place where she could burn the doll. Only now did she notice that she was standing on her own 2 feet and had already taken a couple of steps, moving away from Danny. She walked further step by step, deciding that practice would help her quickly master normal walking, where she would not need to put so much effort into maintaining her balance. And the boy watched her silently. And then he started asking what the child was doing here and what she was looking for. Of course, Selina replied that she was looking for a fireplace, although this answer was only in her thoughts. But the boy heard only the word boo from her lips. Putting the pacifier back into her mouth, which she took out while trying to answer the boy's question, Selina, and in her new life Cheryl, continued on her way. But the boy again began asking questions about where she was going, which finally began to drive the child crazy. And suddenly he suggested that the girl go to the fireplace to warm up. The little witch never expected such a turn of events, and silently allowed herself to be taken by the hand and led to where there was fire. Their path ran through one of the darkest and scariest corridors of the mansion. The boy was clearly very scared, and he talked about the danger of this place, to which Selina responded with her usual facial expressions, believing that if something happened, of course, she had a better chance of surviving. Suddenly, she felt the boy's hands shaking violently from fear. She turned around, once again looking into the face of this little frightened boy. And the more she looked at him, the more she noticed the differences from his father, Edward Bennett, which concerned not so much his appearance as his character. On the other hand, this was understandable, because he was only cold with others, but very gentle with his family. But suddenly, Selina clenched her little fist with the thought that she should not fall for this character, because even her closest people betrayed her in her past life. And no matter how friendly the Bennetts are now, because they only behave this way because of their heir apparent Danny, they cannot be trusted. The boy's voice that they were on the spot distracted Selena from dark thoughts about devotion and betrayal. She turned her head and saw in front of her a fireplace with a flame burning in it, which, as she immediately noticed, was made from a magic pipe that the tower's magicians had been looking for quite some time. Taking out the cursed doll, Selena headed towards the fire. One quick movement sent the cursed doll into the heart of the blazing fire. And a moment later, the doll flashed and disappeared, activating the curse embedded in it. Continuing to stand by the fire for some time, Selena noted that she felt something strange about what she had done. Exhaling, she came to the conclusion that it was time to go back, until the maid accidentally walked into the room and saw her absence. And again, Danny's voice made her wince, saying that nothing should be thrown into the fire. They had already left the room where the fireplace was located and were moving along one of the long corridors of the mansion. Suddenly, the boy stopped and said that he was somehow scared to sleep alone and invited Cheryl to sleep in his room today. Selena was categorically not happy with the prospect of spending the night with this crying boy, which she demonstrated with her head movements. And the boy turned around and, without hiding his fear, looked into the gloomy corridor behind him, the end of which was not visible. Ignoring the child's refusal to go with him, Danny concluded for himself that Cheryl agreed, and happily taking her in his arms, headed to his room. Soon they were already inside his room. Selena was very surprised that she saw a boy in the room. The floors here were covered with soft carpet, unlike her room. And overall, the room was more spacious and much more luxuriously furnished. Bitterly, she concluded that compared to this room, her room was just some kind of hangout. The boy had already approached the bed and was calling Salil to lie with him. Suddenly, Selena caught herself thinking that this boy was very cute and would grow up to be handsome. She also noticed that to some extent he would resemble Christopher, immediately noting that she still remembered that name. Suddenly, she felt herself fly into the air, which was accompanied by the boy's words that it was time to go to bed, and her brother would sing her a lullaby. Selena noted with a smile on her face that the baby was acting very arrogantly, calling himself her brother. While she was thinking about this, Danny had already managed to carry her to the bed, and she didn't even have time to wake up when she found herself lying under a blanket with a boy lying next to her. Danny said that they needed to keep the fact that he was called her brother a secret, and at that time, Selena was thinking that his bed was softer than hers. Wishing good night to his new little sister were his last words for the day, because in her company, he quickly fell asleep. At first, Selena lay with the thought that he could think and say whatever he wanted. As soon as he fell asleep, she would definitely run away. But her eyes slowly began to close too. And within minutes, both children were sleeping peacefully, cuddled up to each other. Dawn came, and with a new day, new events began. The silence of the office where Edward worked was broken by the report of one man who entered inside. The Duke's son did not hear or could not believe what he heard, and therefore asked to repeat what was said. The man who entered repeated that Baron Stone had arrived, whom he escorted to the third guest room. The third room of the Bennett family was used for receiving those of little value, and was furnished in a suitably shabby manner to show the host's attitude towards such guests. Resting his chin in his hand, Edward mockingly concluded that the Stones had completely lost their minds. He then questioned the man about the purpose of the Baron's visit, to which he replied that Baron Stone's wife had died the previous night. This news did not really upset Edward Bennett, since he despised this woman. But out loud, he voiced his misunderstanding of what happened, because he did not send anyone to kill the Baroness. The reporter added that, according to information received, the burnt body of Sabrina Stone was found in one of the rooms. But at the same time, the rest of the interior was not damaged. Nothing burned. There was not even smoke. And in conclusion, the man said that the Baron now suspects the Duke in this death. Edward thought that such suspicions on the part of the Stone family were now completely justified, since the Baroness had suffered his wrath last week. Moving along the corridor, the Duke's son continued to clarify the circumstances of what happened, asking that if it was not a fire, then who set the Baron's wife on fire? To which the man following the gentleman said that no signs of arson or flammable materials were found at the scene of death. After these words, Edward froze in place because he, being an experienced and powerful wizard, realized that someone had activated black magic.